rewrites that whole part of the council, of the document from the Council of Constantinople, and then approves of the documents. So this is another important point that we need to make about ecumenical councils, that the teachings of ecumenical councils do not become official, they're not authentic until they're approved by the Pope. And the Pope has authority to actually change the documents of a council. So we have to keep that in mind. That'll come in play, very important, in the 14th century when we talk about the great, in the 15th century we talk about the great Western schism that erupts. So we have this Council of Constantinople and this whole issue of monothelitism and Pope Honorius, and I bring this up because many times we'll be confronted by our Protestant brothers and sisters who have read a little bit of church history, and they will come across this whole event centering on Pope Honorius, and will try to use this event as a way of trying to prove to us that the Pope is not infallible, that the Pope does not enjoy the charism and the gift of infallibility in the church because we had a Pope in the past who taught heresy. This is what they'll say. And so we need to know the context of that story and know what really happened to be able to counter that attack and defend it and say, you know, Honorius was not a heretic, he never believed heresy, he didn't preach heresy, it was merely a failure on his part to definitively teach against him when he had the opportunity. So very important to know the historical context of that story. So we fast forward now several years into the 8th century, and we come to the great Charlemagne, the emperor whose this time period is named for. Missionaries and the Emperor. The second half of this time period centers around Charlemagne. Charlemagne was the grandson of Charles Martel, of the Battle of Poitiers fame that we talked about in our last session, a great victory that he won over the Muslims in southwestern France. So he was Charles Martel's grandson. Charlemagne was also the son of Pepin, and Pepin's important in the history of Western civilization, the history of the church, because he establishes a new line of Frankish kings. Now, Charles Martel and Pepin were not kings of the France, at least Pepin wasn't originally. Rather, they were called the mayors of the palace. And what that means is the mayors of the palace were basically like the prime ministers of the Frankish kingdom. They were the ones who administered the kingdom for the king and in the king's name, but were not the king himself. They were at this time in the Frankish realm, we have the line of Merovingian kings, who towards the end of their dynasty were very ineffective rulers, and many of them were physically degenerate. And so we have a period of time where the Frankish kingdom is being ruled by this prime minister, really, administered by the prime minister. So he's in effect king, but he doesn't have the title of king. And so what Pepin does, this is the father of Charlemagne, what Pepin does is Pepin sends a letter to the Pope, and he asks the Pope a question. He says, you know, dear Holy Father, who really should be considered the king? He who has the power and authority and acts like a king, or the one who has the title of king and is just known as the king? Who really should be king? And the Pope writes back in his response and says, well, obviously the one who exercises the authority, the one who actually administers, the one who actually acts like a king is king, not those who just have the title, or who just like a puppet. And so Pepin takes this response from the Holy Father and uses it to abolish the Merovingian kings and to establish himself as king of the Franks, and his descendants as king of the Franks as well. And so this second line, or this new line of French kings, or Frankish kings, are called the Carolingians. They take their name from Pepin's son, Charlemagne. The other important thing that Pepin did is that Pepin defeated the Lombards in northern Italy. Remember I talked about how the Lombards had come down into northern Italy and had fought the Byzantines. This is the time of St. Gregory the Great in the 6th century. And so the Lombards come down, they occupy large portions of northern Italy, and Pepin leads his Frankish warriors down to Italy and defeats the Lombards. And then instead of taking the land that he conquered from the Lombards and giving it back to the Byzantines, he instead gives it to the Holy Father. This is known as the donation of Pepin in history. And so this is where the Holy Father, the Pope in Rome, actually becomes the temporal administrator of a region in Italy, of several regions in Italy. And so he becomes a temporal ruler, a secular prince, just like all the other secular kings and rulers in Europe in Western Europe at this time. So, and the Pope would hold on to what this donation of Pepin came to be known as the Papal States. And the Pope would hold on to these lands until the 19th century, where in 1870 they were taken finally away from him and given over to the unified nation of Italy. And the Pope then resides just in the 3.8 mile or acreage of Vatican city-state that we have today. So Pope Stephen III goes and travels actually to France, to modern-day France, to Gaul, to the Kingdom of the Franks, and he gives Pepin and his sons the title Patrician of the Romans, which means that they're the personal protector of the Pope. So again, we see this linkage between the Frankish kingdom and the Holy Father and the papacy that began in our time period at the end of our time period of conversion and councils with the conversion of Clovis. It continues now into this new time period of missionaries and the emperor. Now Charlemagne, then his father Pepin dies. Charlemagne ascends to the throne and becomes king of the Franks. Charlemagne, the description of him, he was a striking man. He was very handsome. He was over 6 feet tall, which for the time was very tall. He had a kingly stride about him, piercing eyes, a long nose, a thick neck, and a good sense of humor. He was a deeply Catholic man. He went to Mass every morning and attended Vespers or evening prayer every night. So he was a devoted son of the church, and it shows throughout his reign as king of the Franks. He engaged in a series of military campaigns throughout his rule. In particular, he campaigned into Spain, where he fought the Muslims towards the end of the 8th century. That one campaign actually led to his defeat, and he had to hightail it back to modern-day France and to Gaul. And there's a famous poem, an epic poem, written of this time. It's called The Song of Roland. And it tells the story of Roland, who was in the rear guard of Charlemagne's army, and how Roland and these knights in the rear guard fought off this Muslim army so that Charlemagne and the rest of his knights could escape and get back into France. He also engaged in a 30-year campaign against the Saxons. Now the Saxons were a fierce and wild, savage pagan tribe on the eastern end of Charlemagne's frontiers. And the Saxons were so fierce and so pagan that they actually practiced human sacrifice and cannibalism. They were a wild and fierce people. And so Charlemagne wanted to convert them and bring them over to the faith. He wanted to, first of all, pacify them, bring them into his empire, but he also wanted to bring the light of Christ to these pagans, so that his realm, everyone in his realm and on the frontiers would be Catholic. And so, he sends missionaries. The missionaries had a difficult time trying to convert the Saxons. And so Charlemagne realized that the only way to convert the Saxons was to engage in a military campaign to actually convert them by force. Now this is important for us to think about and realize that Charlemagne, his normal practice was not to convert people by the sword. It was to do so peacefully through the sending of missionaries. But the Saxons were very different people altogether, and did not respond to peaceful conversion. So they had to be converted by the sword. And I bring this up because sometimes we'll hear in our modern day people talking about Charlemagne and how he converted people by the sword, and how the church embraced that, and the church even advocated Charlemagne doing that. And there's no historical proof of that at all. This was an initiative of Charlemagne. Charlemagne wanted to convert the Saxons, and he knew the only way he could do so was to bring them in by force. And again, that wasn't his standard policy. Now what would happen is Charlemagne would go into the region in Saxony, he would fight a series of battles, he would fight a campaign, he would defeat the Saxon army, and the Saxon king or ruler would then convert and would, in order to bring about peace. But as soon as Charlemagne and his army left Saxony and went back into the Frankish realm, they would revert to their pagan ways. And this went back and forth for 30 long years. This occupied the vast majority of Charlemagne's time as king. Now, after the conversion, Charlemagne passed these laws that are called capitularies. And there are several that are dedicated towards the Saxons and their conversion, and they're very strict and kind of severe laws. But again, the reason, the background, the context for those severe laws is because the Saxons were these fiercely wild pagan people who showed that they easily could revert back to paganism. So one of these laws that he had passed was anyone who in contempt of the Christian faith refuses to respect the holy fast of Lent and eats meat shall be put to death. So if you ate meat during Lent and you were in Saxony and under the reign of Charlemagne, you could die. So that makes it seem not too bad for us today, right? We only have to abstain every Friday during Lent, only a couple of fasting days. Pretty easy compared to what it was under Charlemagne's rule. He also had another law that said anyone who commits a dead body to the flames following pagan rites shall be put to death. So if you engaged in any kind of pagan practice, you were put to death. In Charlotte, it seems kind of harsh, but again, we have to understand the reason for why he had these laws. Ultimately, Charlemagne moves from being king of the Franks to being crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope. And the whole background to that is Pope Leo III is attacked by a mob while he's in public procession in Rome. Now, as we'll see, this is a very difficult time for the papacy. This 8th century, as we're moving into the 9th century, it was a period of a lot of unrest in Rome, of many different Italian noble families trying to gain control of the papacy. And so it was not a very safe time for the Pope to live. So Pope Leo III is walking through Rome in a public procession. He's attacked by a mob. He miraculously escapes, and he is able to flee Rome and goes to France to meet with Charlemagne. While he's there, Charlemagne hears of this attack and decides to send Leo back under his guard, under Frankish soldiers. And then Charlemagne promises that he'll go to Rome and meet with the Pope and kind of restore things and place things back into order in a little bit. So he makes the trip to Rome in November of the year 800, and then a month later, in December, on Christmas Day of the year 800, after a gap of 324 years, Charlemagne is crowned Roman Empire emperor by the Pope. And so this is not just Charlemagne becomes a Roman emperor, but he's not like Roman emperors of the past. He's considered and called the Holy Roman Emperor because the Pope crowned him, and he now is king and emperor over this large patrimony in Western Europe and the personal protector of the Holy Father. So we begin to see here the beginnings of Christendom, the uniting of Western European society with the Church, and of the kings in particular, kings and rulers of Europe, following the laws and the teachings of the Church, and even seeking approval and receiving approval from the Pope. Now, to kind of illustrate pictorially the effect of Charlemagne's reign, we have in your workbook a map that shows the extent of Charlemagne's empire. So if you turn to the back in your appendix, you'll see this map of Charlemagne's empire. And basically, it encompasses all of modern-day France, most of modern-day Germany, and even parts of Italy. So in a certain sense, and simply since the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century, Western Europe finally is united once again under one ruler, under this Holy Roman Emperor of Charlemagne. Charlemagne was a great Christian ruler. He ruled alone in his realm for 42 years. One historian has said that Constantine gave men the vision of what a Christian emperor could do. Charlemagne gave men the vision of what a Christian emperor did do. So there's a distinction between Constantine and Charlemagne. Both were placed in control of this wide-ranging empire and were very favorable to the Church. Both, though, each of them took their role with the Church in a very different light, in a very different understanding. Constantine, there was so much potential there with Constantine to do what a Christian emperor could do, to show what a Christian emperor could do. Charlemagne really was the embodiment of what a Christian emperor would do and did do. And so he really goes forth and spreads his authority throughout his empire and brings back to Western Europe the sense of unity which she had lost once the Roman Empire had fallen. Now, his Holy Roman Empire that he was founded upon him in his coronation here in the year 800 would last for 1,000 years. The Holy Roman Empire would not be abolished and dissolved until 1806. It was dissolved by Napoleon, actually. Now, Charlemagne is also important not only for his role as Holy Roman Emperor and for uniting, in a certain sense, part of Western Europe, and also being the personal protector of the Holy Father, but he also is famous and known for his contributions to Western culture and what's known as the Carolingian Renaissance. When Charlemagne was very, very involved with and saw the importance of education. He wanted people in his realm to be educated, or at least a good portion of his people to be educated. So he undertook an extensive revival of the arts, architecture, education, and government. He wanted to form throughout his realm this united culture. We talked about how Rome, in our time period of persecution, was united culturally. And this was a great dream of Charlemagne, that this great patrimony of art and architecture would exist throughout his realm. And we have, during this time leading up to Charlemagne, really, there was a period of stagnation in Western Europe. It was a period where things were just maintained and they were just preserved. There was no movement, there was no innovation in art or architecture education. It was really just kind of maintaining what had been handed down to you, but not advance it. So Charlemagne took this opportunity to really begin the advancement of Western culture, to spur it on, to take it out of its period of stagnation and move it forward in an aggressive and vibrant way. And so one way in which he did this is through education. And he brought to his kingdom a very brilliant scholar, a man by the name of Alcuin of York, an English scholar. And Alcuin of York had received the patrimony of the work of the great Saint Bede. Sometimes we call him the Venerable Bede. The Venerable Bede was alive before Alcuin, but he was a very influential Englishman and a saint of the church who wrote extensively. And so Alcuin of York was the beneficiary of Saint Bede's educational output and of his treatises and his books. And so Alcuin took that patrimony, went to Charlemagne's kingdom, and then founded and created what we know as today as the liberal arts curriculum. He established the 7 subjects that make up the liberal arts curriculum: the quadrivium and the trivium. The trivium are the 3 subjects of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And the quadrivium are the subjects of arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. These are the 7 liberal arts. To have a well-rounded, fine education is to be immersed in these liberal arts. And so, this carries on to us today. So many universities who have liberal arts education or focus on the liberal arts, they're the beneficiaries of the work of Alcuin of York and of the patrimony and the patronage, really, of Charlemagne. Now, not only did Charlemagne bring Alcuin of York to start this educational revival in his realm, but also he established scriptoriums throughout his realm in Benedictine monasteries, where he had monks copy the scriptures in classical literature. And we have a large amount of manuscripts from this period of time written by monks during the reign of Charlemagne. Over 7,000 manuscripts exist in the world from this time, when monks were copying and writing. So a lot of our knowledge of classical literature really comes from copies of works written in Charlemagne's scriptoria. So when we come back from our break, we'll finish our discussion of Charlemagne and talk about the end of Charlemagne and what happened to this empire that he created. And we'll also look at another heresy that arises in the East, which the church has to deal with, the heresy of iconoclasm. So all these subjects and more we'll talk about when we come back after this break. Journey through church history. We've been talking about our time period, missionaries and the emperor. And we just finished before the break our discussion of Charlemagne and the importance of Charlemagne to the church and to Western civilization. In particular, how he began this, or he started this revival of art, architecture, and education throughout his realm. And how important this effort of cultural unity was to Charlemagne was also important for us because it forms the bedrock and the foundation, really, of our education today, this liberal arts curriculum that was created by Alcuin of York, who Charlemagne brought over from England into his realm in France. Now Charlemagne, the achievements of Charlemagne are many. He subjected and brought into his empire Lombardy, Saxony, Bavaria, and southern Gaul. So he creates, as we said, we have in your workbook, in the appendix, a map of Charlemagne's rule. So we can see all these areas that he was able to bring into his empire. He was the protector of the Romans, the personal protector of the Pope, and was crowned by the Holy Father as Holy Roman Emperor, restoring to a certain level the unity of government and culture that had existed under the Roman Empire before it fell in the later part of the 5th century. Now, in 806, he followed Frankish custom and divided his empire among his 3 sons, Pepin, Louis, and Charles. In 814, Charlemagne dies, and unfortunately with him and with his death, his empire